22. The Gathering Web. The sun eventually punched through the cloud cover, but the day remained cold and dank. Nevertheless, Emma Marco had taken her daughter down to the local playground as she had promised. Children were playing on the jungle gym and swing set and sandbox, but today Penny wasn't especially energetic. Sure, she'd been excited enough about going over to the playground, but once there, she'd started feeling lethargic. Naturally, Emma didn't force her to run around like a nut. Instead, she sat next to her on a bench, reading to Penny from The Arabian Nights. Penny was bundled up against the cold, a baseball cap perched jauntily atop her head. Penny leaned against her mother, relaxing, and then Emma felt her stiffen. Then Penny was pointing and saying, "Look, there's Daddy!" Emma looked where Penny was indicating, praying the child was wrong. No such luck. Sure enough, there was Flint Marco, seated on a bench across the playground. He was watching them like some sort of stalker. He gave a tentative wave at being spotted, and even smiled, but Emma did not return it. Instead, scowling, she drew her daughter tightly to her and said, "I know your father's made promises to you, but he's always made promises he couldn't keep. So don't get your hopes up, and don't count on him for anything. He'll only break your heart." "But he came back," she said plaintively. Penny looked back at her father, then reacted with surprise and confusion. Emma was likewise surprised to see that Flint was no longer there. Where did he go? "Mama, my snow globe." What? The snow globe was back home in Penny's bedroom. Why would she be asking for it now? Then she understood what Penny was talking about. A beautiful, ornate sandcastle, similar to the one in Penny's globe, had arisen in the middle of the sandbox. This one, though, was 10 feet tall. It hadn't been there seconds ago. Its existence was impossible, and that merely added to the aura of magic that surrounded it. Penny slid off the bench and approached it before Emma could stop her. The child walked toward it, studying it, then cautiously touched it. She made a small fingerprint in the sand, then lay her palm flat against the surface to make a handprint. Emma went to Penny and took her firmly by the hand, brushing the stray particles off her palm. Penny offered a token protest, but Emma ignored her, pulling her away from the sandcastle, never even noticing the larger handprint that had magically appeared next to Penny's. As Penny and Emma retreated into the distance, Flint Marco reformed himself from the sandcastle and watched them go. Ah, the family. Marco spun and faced a figure leaning against a tree, obscured by the shadows. The voice was soft and menacing. "The bulwark. I'll bet money can solve your problems." "How did you find me?" demanded Marco. "I sensed you," replied the newcomer. He reached out and plucked invisible strings in the air. "I saw a particular vibration along a particular line that only I could see and followed it right to you." Marco had no idea what this guy was talking about, but at least he wasn't making any aggressive move. That was probably a good thing. Forming the castle had taken a lot out of him. He was still recovering from having been a creature of mud. For a while he thought he would never be able to reconstitute himself. He might be ready for a fight in a while, but not at this very moment. "Do I know you?" he asked suspiciously. "You should." "Who are you? What do you want?" "What you want? Spider-Man. Together he's ours." Ah, this perked up Marco's ears. Spider-Man had massively inconvenienced him, damn near killed him. He certainly wouldn't mind seizing the opportunity to take that punk down. Whatever sympathy he'd felt for Spider-Man over his personal loss was long gone. Considering the grief that Spider-Man had caused him, returning some aggravation would be a pleasure. "What's the little girl's name?" asked the stranger. Marco's eyes narrowed. "Penny." "Penny. How sweet." He tried to gauge whether this stranger presented a threat to his daughter, and finally decided that he didn't. At least not now. "What's your plan? I'll only go so far, and if you push me more, I'll stomp you into the ground." "Ooh, I like that," said the man, and he stepped from the shadows, and yet seemed to take the shadows with him.
"Now you're talking."
Later that night, Peter Parker lingered across the street from Mary Jane's apartment. He had spent much of the day sleeping off complete exhaustion. Considering all that he had been through, it was understandable. Once he had awakened, he had gathered together containment equipment, large, clear containers that he could seal airtight, screwed up his courage, and returned to the church. He had searched it high and low, but that just simply confirmed what his spider sense had already told him. The symbiote wasn't there. He chided himself over waiting so long, but what else could he have done? He checked out the surrounding neighborhood, but there remained no sign of it. Irritated and weary, he went home. He considered calling Gwen and trying to explain what the hell had happened the night before. But really, how could he possibly? "Sorry, Gwen, I wasn't myself. I was infested by an evil alien symbiote." Yeah, that was going to fly. Gwen would just have to be a problem for another day. What about MJ, though? Everything that he had to say. How did one put that in a phone message? He knew he had to see her, and so he went over to her apartment building and prepared to march up to her door and... Peter remained where he was for half an hour, wrestling with the best way to approach it. He briefly regretted having parted company with the symbiote. It may have posed a number of problems for him, but leaving him indecisive was certainly not one of them. Finally, Mary Jane emerged from her apartment, ready for work. She adjusted her hair and glanced at her watch. Apparently she was running late, for she started scanning the street for a cab. A taxi farther down the street started to angle toward her. Then another cab, which had been parked curbside with its sign atop reading "Off Duty," suddenly roared to life and cut directly across the street toward Mary Jane. She jumped, a little startled, as the cab farther down screeched to a halt to avoid slamming into the one that was now facing Mary Jane. Taken slightly aback, Mary Jane nevertheless climbed into the back of the overly aggressive cab, pulling the door shut behind her. Moments later, the taxi sped away into the night. The cabbie who had unceremoniously been cut off wasn't taking it lying down. He leaned out of the driver's side window and rattled off a string of invective in a foreign language. Then he turned to Peter and demanded, "Did you see that? Did you see that?" Peter had, in fact, although he didn't give it much thought. What he had not seen was the cabbie in the taxi that had picked up Mary Jane. When Mary Jane had settled into the back seat, a leering Eddie Brock had turned into the seat and said, "Where to, ma'am?" Nor did Peter see the body of the cab's legitimate owner, since it had been dumped in an alleyway some blocks away. Nor, worst of all, did his spider sense tell him that anything was wrong, because the symbiote was now invisible to his spider sense. If Eddie Brock had come up to Peter on a subway platform and tried to push him in front of an oncoming train, Peter would never have known about it until it was too late. So it was that Peter Parker went home, feeling that he hadn't accomplished anything the entire day, and unaware that his day was only just beginning. 23. Crisis Point. Harry Osborn sat in his apartment in darkness, something he much preferred nowadays. He was facing a wall with assorted television screens on it, each tuned to a different TV station. Typically, he used them for various sporting events. Now, though, he was watching a variety of news outlets, and all of them were focusing on the same developing story. CBS. All New York is holding its breath as the hostage situation continues to unfold. NBC. A clip of a construction site showed a multi-dimensional latticework of what could only be described as black webbing, suspended 70 stories above the ground. Several items were snagged in the giant web: construction barrels, a shovel, an industrial dumpster, and a taxi cab, all dotting it like so many flies caught in a spider's web. ABC. A SWAT team in riot gear was advancing on the construction site in armored Humvees. The sand beneath them heaved. Harry loved this part. It was chaotic and destructive. They'd run it 20 times, and each time was better than the last. The vehicles were sent tumbling. 2 Humvees crashed down upon the construction site. Pedestrians in the streets scattered as the third vehicle tumbled toward them and crushed an empty taxi. CNN. Every attempt by the police to rescue the hostage has been thwarted by the Sandman. Compounding the danger is the appearance of a strange black-suited figure. Early reports had believed him to be the black-suited Spider-Man, but he has now been identified as something entirely different. Sure enough, someone in the black spider suit was leering like a jackal as the camera zoomed in on him. He swung down, dispatching members of the SWAT team with disturbing ease. Some tried to get a shot off and didn't even come close. He tossed them aside, juggling them like plates and showing them to be just as easily breakable. Harry sighed heavily to the empty room. So much violence on TV these days. MSNBC. They had a helicopter. Good for them. The news camera aboard zoomed in on the taxi that was up in the webbing, and a terrified Mary Jane Watson was in the back seat. The hostage has been identified as Mary Jane Watson, an actor recently seen in a brief stint on Broadway. She is currently a singing waitress at a downtown jazz club. We are now going to take you live to the scene with News Action Team reporter Jennifer Dugan. The camera shifted to the site. A mini-skirted young woman looked to be in way over her head and knew it. She was game, though. Harry had to credit her that. Running alongside her camera team, she was saying, "We're only 100 feet away now, Howland. Wait." The camera view whipped around as the black-suited figure fired black web lines up at the partially completed skyscraper. Incredibly, the web lines were creating letters. "It seems to be some kind of message," Jennifer Dugan announced. The camera was only picking up a few letters. A T, an O, some others. "Pull back," said an annoyed Harry to the TV. "Give us a better view." As if responding to his demand, the cameraman promptly pulled back, and the entire message came into view. "Spider-Man, stop us if you can." "If Spider-Man did come, it would be a suicide mission," Dugan declared. "For what chance would he have against—" Harry pushed the mute button. He'd heard enough. He slumped back in his chair, closed his eyes. He wasn't certain he was capable of feeling anything anymore. A stiff breeze blew across his apartment from the balcony. He thought he had closed the large glass doors and started to stand up to attend to it. Then he stopped in his tracks. Peter Parker was standing in the open doorway. He looked humbled. When he spoke, Harry had to strain to hear him. "I can't take them both," Peter admitted. "Not by myself." Harry stood in the shadows for a moment, then stepped forward into the narrow sliver of light cast by the nearby lamp. It was just enough for Peter to see his ruined face. Half of it was now hideous, grotesque, mangled from the bomb that Peter had hurled at him. Peter was clearly shocked by the sight, taken aback. Here was a stark, irrefutable reminder of the black costume's continuing legacy, and he clearly wanted to look away, but could not do so. His shoulders sagged, and he looked stricken with despair, apparently knowing that he had embarked upon a fool's errand, but being committed to seeing it through. "I need your help, Harry." There were so many things Harry wanted to say at that moment. None of them, though, could surpass the elegant simplicity of, "Get out." Harry turned away, and when he glanced back, saw that Peter had indeed departed. Harry started pacing the room, thinking of Mary Jane trapped, thinking of Peter hurtling towards certain death to save her. because that was what Peter was going to do. Harry was positive of that. Peter was just that determined, just that heroic, just that reckless, and just that stupid to go in against overwhelming odds. Something that he couldn't possibly survive. "You lucky stiff," his father's voice growled in Harry's head. "He's going to die, and all you have to do to make that happen is to do nothing. And considering you were always good for nothing, this is something that even you can't screw up." Harry buried his head in his hands, his father's voice overwhelming. He sagged against the wall, choking back a sob. Then became aware of Bernard standing in the main entranceway of the great room. "If I may, sir," said Bernard. Harry shrugged. "I've seen things in this house I've never spoken of." The butler continued. "I've watched a darkness come over your father, a madness that cost him his life." Why was Bernard bringing all this up? "What are you trying to tell me?" Harry said, ghosts screaming in his ears. Bernard took a deep breath and let it out. "The night your father died, I cleaned his wound. The blade that pierced his body came from his glider, his invention. Only he could have discharged it." Harry was stunned. Bernard knew? Here he thought he'd managed to keep his secrets from the faithful servant. Bernard had been out visiting relatives on the night of Peter's attack. Despite the severity of his wounds, Harry had still managed to hide away the more incriminating elements of the goblin's equipment. When Bernard had returned, Harry had told the appalled retainer that he'd injured himself in a chemical experiment gone terribly wrong, and had refused all pleas to go to the hospital. But now Bernard was claiming that he'd actually known the truth, going all the way back to his father's original sin? He knew what Norman Osborn had become? Known what he was capable of? Why hadn't he said anything at the time? The answer was obvious, really. Bernard had been with the family for as long as Harry could remember. The old butler's peculiar code of ethics simply wouldn't have allowed him to tell the world of his master's wrongdoings. Plus, from a practical standpoint, if Bernard did go around and tell people, Norman might well seek him out and kill him. And since Norman had died, what point was there in letting people know? "I know you're defending your father's honor, but there's no question that he died by his own hand," Bernard assured him. "I loved your father, as I have loved you, as your friends love you." Harry had nothing to say. So Bernard turned and walked away, leaving Harry in the darkness and to his own miseries. 24. Something in the Air. It appealed to Mary Jane's morbid sense of humor that Eddie Brock had left the meter running even as he suspended the cab some 75 stories in the air. She currently owed in excess of $80 and couldn't help but think that insult was most definitely being heaped upon injury. As the cab gently swayed in the wind, she heard what sounded like fingers gently vibrating the strings of a piano. She mulled over her predicament. "Why do they always come after me?" she wondered aloud. "What, do I have the word bait stamped on my forehead? Did somebody stick a capture me sign on my back?" A strand of web snapped with a sound like a banjo string coming undone. Her car dropped a few feet, then somersaulted downward. Mary Jane screamed as the taxi tore through several webs and tumbled end over end. Mary Jane was slammed around inside the cab. Then it snagged on another level of the massive web and halted 70 stories up. From far, far below, she thought she heard something. A distant cry of approval. Sick bastards. They were waiting for her to fall. They wanted to see a show. What were things coming to that... Suddenly, something landed on the hood of the cab. Mary Jane jumped back, startled, assuming that it was her captor. Instead, the masked face of Spider-Man peered in at her. "Peter," she gasped with a mixture of both relief and dread. "They're never going to let you out of here alive." He didn't seem to know what to say. Finally, he told her, "I'm sorry I pushed you." She didn't know whether to laugh or cry, and settled for a combination of both. Here she was, dangling high above certain death, and Peter was apologizing for what had happened at the jazz room. It was really kind of sweet, although right now he needed to get his priorities in order. She spotted her black-clad captor swinging straight towards Spider-Man. Peter wasn't reacting. It was as if he didn't sense the impending danger. Mary Jane let out an alarmed cry and pointed, and Spider-Man turned to see. It wasn't nearly enough time to get out of his attacker's way as a mighty kick knocked Spider-Man head first through the windshield. Mary Jane, who had left the plastic partition open between the passengers and the driver's seat, instantly regretted that as she was showered with glass. Spider-Man, recovering quickly, vaulted over the rooftop and landed on the trunk, almost sliding off before getting a firm grip. Mary Jane and he looked up as the black-suited creature stood atop the hood, looming over them. The black goo that constituted its mask receded, revealing the face of the man who'd been driving the cab. His burning eyes stared down at them. Beyond that he had taken her captive, Mary Jane had no clue who he was. But from Spider-Man's reaction, she knew that Peter recognized him immediately. "Hey, pal. Remember me?" "Oh my God," gasped Spider-Man. "Eddie Brock?" "No, not Eddie. Not anymore." "I'm poison to you now, Spider-Man," he said, flicking his tongue around. "I'm Venom. And I just want you to know I took your advice. You told me if I wanted forgiveness, I should find religion. So I went to church last night and asked for it. I asked for everything that had been taken away from me. Damned if I didn't get it. And more. I was handed power I never dreamed of, Pete. It just poured down on me as if from
heaven itself."
"You've got to take off the suit," Spider-Man told him. Venom leaped to the rear of the car and kicked Spider-Man across the face, knocking him from the vehicle. Spider-Man fell, tearing through several strands of web, finally coming to rest about 60 stories up, in a sticky place in the web where the strands were thick enough to obscure the view from the news cameras. But they had already managed to catch enough. When Gwen Stacy had learned that Mary Jane Watson was the one captured in the black webbing at the construction site, nothing that her father had said or done could convince her to stay away from the scene. She knew that she wasn't in any way responsible for Mary Jane's predicament. But after what had happened at the jazz room, she felt an odd kinship to her. She'd even done some research into Mary Jane's past, and marveled at the spectacularly bad luck the girl had had. According to police reports, she'd been captured by Dr. Octopus shortly before that madman's all-too-timely death. And before that, apparently the Green Goblin had dangled her off one of the towers of the 59th Street Bridge, then dropped her. Now, watching the TV monitors while her father organized the rescue efforts, Gwen saw that freakish anti-Spider-Man peel back his face mask through some odd means. She was even more shocked at what it revealed. "Eddie!" she gasped. Her earlier belief that she had nothing to do with Mary Jane's situation instantly vanished. She ran from the monitor and sought out her father, who was focusing on high above with a pair of binoculars. "That's Eddie up there," she told him. "Gwen, step back," Captain Stacy said. "You can't help here." "I feel responsible." "You're not responsible for the actions of a madman," her father assured her. But Gwen felt that way nonetheless. Her father, though, was clearly not interested, and she had to admit she couldn't really blame him. "Excuse me, Captain." Police Officer Knock was hauling a nervous-looking man forward. The man was waving some sort of ID that indicated he was part of a research facility. "This man, he's a doctor, claims to have some important information." "What's this about, Doctor Captain Stacy glanced at the ID. Dr. Wallace? Flint Marco. Captain Stacy frowned. What about him? I don't know how to tell you this, but... Dr. Wallace indicated a nearby news monitor that was replaying Sandman's annihilation of the Humvees. This Sandman creature, it's him. Look, he said pleadingly, I know why he's doing this. It might help you to stop him. 60 stories up, Spider-Man struggled in the webbing. As he started to pull free of it, Venom dropped down from overhead and webbed up Peter's wrist, binding it to the giant black web. Before Spider-Man could move, his other wrist was webbed up as well. Pinned, his arms outstretched, Spider-Man was trapped. Venom came down with a flying knee drop to Spider-Man's ribs, cracking them. Spider-Man yelled in pain, and Venom reached down, yanking Spider-Man's mask clear. Peter gasped for air and hoped that he was still out of range of the TV cameras. The prospect of Aunt May being home, watching this, and seeing Peter's face flashing across the screen was unsettling. Then again, that might turn out to be the least of his problems. 73 stories above the ground, the industrial steel dumpster that was hanging in the top portion of the web began to shift position. Strands that held it in place were beginning to break. 3 stories below the dumpster, Mary Jane watched helplessly as it tilted toward her. I don't know who Eddie Brock is, or what he wants, but he's really pissing me off, she thought bleakly. Seeing the imminent threat to Mary Jane, Peter turned toward Venom and said desperately, What do you want, Eddie?
I wanted to see you again, Pete,
Venom said with great cheer, as if they were 2 old buddies hooking up again at a school reunion.
And talk with you and, well, to be honest, I want to kill you.
We can find a way to settle this.
You are so right. I was thinking humiliation, just as you humiliated me. But televised, live-action coverage.
He held his hands up as if envisioning it in a headline or on a marquee.
Spider-Man screws up, and sweet little Mary Jane dies.
He lowered his hands and came in close to Peter. Foul breath, like burnt metal, washed over Peter, who wondered if he'd reeked like that when he'd been wearing the thing.
You made me lose my girl. Now I'm gonna make you lose yours. With the help of my friend Sandy. I think you've met.
As a terrible groan of metal came from high above, Peter looked up and his heart thudded with alarm. The dumpster's steel lid swung open. Cinder blocks, concrete slabs, and heavy metal brackets began to slide out. They rained down on Mary Jane's taxi, ricocheting off with loud clanging and clacking sounds. Peter could see Mary Jane getting low in the back seat, trying to avoid the deadly impacts. He also saw that they were tearing away the webs that supported the car. As they rebounded off the cab, they hailed down upon Spider-Man and Venom, tearing through the webs around them. Venom dodged a falling slab of concrete, while a cinder block tore through the web, freeing one of Peter's hands. Peter reached out, grabbed Venom's ankle, and pulled him off balance. Venom hit the webbing right next to Peter, and the both of them swayed as Peter grappled one-handed with his tormentor, while heavy objects fell all around them. Suddenly, a key support of the web was severed by a jagged piece of metal, and the 2 of them were in free fall. Liberated from the web restraints, Peter struggled at close quarters with Venom as they tumbled end over end. The ground was coming up incredibly fast, and Peter fired webs at the last instant to break his fall. Out the corner of his eye, he saw Venom doing the same thing, and although the webbing slowed them down, it didn't completely save them from violent landings as they hit the ground hard. Peter lay there for a moment, unmoving, trying to determine whether he'd broken anything on impact. He moved his limbs and decided that he hadn't, although his chest was still aching from where Venom had been tap-dancing on his ribs. He hauled himself to his feet and discovered that, fortunately, they were blocked from the view of the crowd by a power shovel, a bulldozer, and some other construction equipment. His Spider-Man mask was lying a couple feet away. He staggered toward it, picked it up, and pulled it on. As he reeled, the world spinning around him, his spider sense warned him at the last second as Flint Marco's rock-hard fist came swinging right into his field of vision. But he wasn't fast enough to dodge it. It connected, hard, and Spider-Man tumbled backward, only to meet the fist of Venom, driving him back in the other direction. He fired a web upward to try to get away, but Sandman once again slammed into him. This time, the impact sent Spider-Man against one of the steel uprights, knocking the wind out of him. Penny Marco had initially been unhappy as the news broadcast had knocked Jeopardy off the air. It was her favorite show, even if her impulse was to pronounce it Geo-Party. But as she'd watched, she'd found herself fascinated by the images of the person everyone was calling Sandman. They kept showing the same sequences with him over and over, and now she got to her knees and drew close to the screen. She reached up and touched it tentatively as Sandman tossed aside all efforts of the SWAT teams to rescue people. "Mama?" she said slowly. "I think that's Daddy." Emma called back from the kitchen. "What's Daddy?" She emerged to see what Penny was referring to, and Penny pointed wordlessly to the TV. At first, Emma laughed and was about to tell Penny that she didn't know what she was talking about. Then she took a closer look, and Penny could see by the change in her mother's expression that Mama likewise thought it was Daddy. She was shaking her head, though, trying to deny it to herself. "The sandcastle," said Penny. Her mother, still appearing shell-shocked, looked wordlessly at the little girl. "I was with him. That's him." She tapped the screen. "He's doing this for me. I can feel it, Mama." There was a knock at the door so unexpected and intrusive that both Penny and Emma jumped in alarm. Penny headed to the door, ignoring her mother's warnings not to open it for strangers. A police officer was standing there, and next to him another man. "Penny?" he said, and when she nodded, he extended a hand and smiled gently. "I'm Dr. Wallace. We need to talk. Quickly." Pounded back and forth between Sandman and Venom, Spider-Man's bloodied body slammed it to the ground. He lay there, trying to will himself to get to his feet, to grow 4 extra arms or become 10 times as strong. Something, anything that would give him a fighting chance. High above him, he heard the sound of groaning metal and looked skyward through blurred vision. The noise was coming from the dumpster. Shifting in the web and leaning more and more toward Mary Jane's taxi. Desperately, he tried to haul himself to his feet to get there in time, and suddenly the dumpster tore away and plummeted straight down. Spider-Man, horrified, could only watch as the dumpster winged the cab, causing it to roll onto its side. Mary Jane smacked up against the driver's side door, popping it open. She shrieked as she fell from the car. Grabbing, she snagged the closed door on the driver's side, reached through, and clung to the steering wheel. She dangled there, clutching on for dear life. "MJ!" screamed Spider-Man. With effort, he willed himself to stand. He swayed in place, tried not to puke inside his mask. 500 tons of sand pulled together, sweeping up tractors and power shovels as it rose to form a gigantic Sandman. He loomed over Spider-Man, hundreds of feet high, with a roaring sound like that of a tornado brought to life. It, for he would simply not have seemed appropriate, came after Spider-Man, smashing the ground with its massive fists and feet as it tried to crush the dodging blue and red-clad figure. Spider-Man had a brief glimmer of hope, because as powerful as Sandman was, Spider-Man had him beat out on speed. He was too quick and agile for the lumbering giant to catch, but Sandman apparently came to the same conclusion, for he changed his form again, extending his hands into giant paws that reached down for Spider-Man. Firing a web line, Spider-Man bounded clear of the terrifying sand hands, but he didn't get far. Venom came leaping forward, intercepting him in midair and landing a powerful kick that knocked Spider-Man into a girder. Hey, gorgeous, what are you doing here? Oh, just hanging around. Mary Jane, clutching the steering wheel like a bat, was busy writing her own jovial dialogue in her head. It was a witty exchange between herself and Peter that would show just how plucky our heroine was and how dashing our hero. It helped take her mind off the fact that her fingers were growing tired. She tried to haul herself up into the driver's seat. Perhaps she could buckle herself in, last a little longer. But she didn't have the opportunity, as her fingers, far more fatigued than she'd thought, gave way, and she plummeted from the car. Shrieking, tearing through the weakest strands of the gigantic black web, she was finally halted by the bottommost strands of the webbing. She bounced up and down for a few moments, steadying herself, and then looked up to see what new calamity was about to befall her. She was becoming cynical enough to assume that there would certainly be something. Her cynicism paid off. The taxi was 10 stories above her and about to tear loose from its precarious perch on the web. When it did, it would crush her, and there was nowhere for her to go. Dear Lord, please make it quick. Then she corrected herself. To hell with that, make it slow. Drag it out and give Peter time to get here. Spider-Man was running out of time. He was scampering up one of the girders when a black web line wrapped tightly around his throat, yanking him backward. He dropped 2 stories, smacking onto a crossbeam. 1 story below, Venom was pulling on the web line, strangling him. The world was turning into a red haze around Spider-Man, and in the distance he heard Venom shouting, "Now! Kill him now!" Going on the assumption that Venom wasn't addressing him, Spider-Man figured he was talking to Sandman. Sure enough, a shadow loomed over the struggling Spider-Man. It was Sandman, all right. Bigger than King Kong and twice as formidable. Jennifer Dugan looked out from the TV screen in Harry Osborn's apartment. It's hard to believe what's happening. I don't know how we could take any more. This is the end of Spider-Man. Harry Osborn wasn't listening. I'm sorry, MJ. I tried. No one could have tried more. Even as he thought that, Spider-Man didn't cease struggling against the webbing that was holding him down, trying to get clear of the massive form of Sandman that was about to annihilate him. A tiny copper ball sailed out of the clouds and lodged onto the back of Sandman's massive head. Sandman turned, sensing something behind him. Spider-Man barely had time to see that what had landed on Sandman's head was shaped like a pumpkin before it detonated. Chunks of sandstone exploded from the side of Sandman's head. Stunned by the impact, he crumbled like a massive statue. Mary Jane didn't know where to look first. She saw the mighty Sandman collapse. She saw Venom on the ground looking up in confusion. Then she twisted around and saw what Venom was already looking at. A man astride what looked like a flying high-tech snowboard, which was roaring like a jet engine. She recognized the gadget immediately. The rider a moment later. "Harry!" she cried out in joy. Although she felt a quick flash of anger over the way Harry had manipulated her to hurt Peter. For whatever reason, he was now coming in on the side of the angels. There was still a lot to be explained, a good deal she didn't understand. For one thing, my God, what happened to his face? But it could wait until they all got out of here alive. An optimistic view to have, but at least she suddenly had one. Harry chortled with self-satisfied glee as he rammed the sky stick into Venom, knocking him aside and sending him crashing against a crossbeam like a beanbag. He landed next to Spider-Man, who looked as if he'd just gone 12 rounds with a giant mutant Cuisinart. Unable to understand what had just happened, Spider-Man looked up at him tentatively, confused. Instead of bothering to explain, Harry simply extended a hand to his old friend and helped him to his feet. I can't believe you're here, Spider-Man said. Harry nodded, apparently just in the nick of time. Spider-Man rubbed the back of his neck, and Harry suspected that, under his mask, Peter was wincing. Well, 5 minutes ago would have been good, too. The distant sound of snapping web lines caught their attention. They looked up just in time to see the taxi above Mary Jane breaking loose. Mary Jane rolled aside, barely avoiding the car as it ripped down through the weakening strands of black web. It continued its death plunge, tumbling end over end several times before crashing to the ground 60 stories below. But in passing, it damaged the web that Mary Jane was clinging to. The entire thing was rapidly shredding. Clearly, she only had seconds left. Harry revved the sky stick. "Hop on!" he shouted. Spider-Man needed no further urging. He leapt aboard, and they raced upward toward Mary Jane. Too late. The giant black web gave way. Mary Jane tore loose from the last of its strands into thin air. No way, no freaking way, thought Harry desperately as he angled the sky stick around, diving after her. And he would have been surprised to learn that Peter was thinking the exact same thing. "Give it everything!" Spider-Man shouted as the sky stick raced to catch up with her. Harry gunned the engine, zipping after the plummeting Mary Jane. They were heading straight for the ground. Harry was now coming to a terrible realization. "We're diving too fast! I won't be able to pull up! Just a little longer? Pete! Almost!" Harry wanted to be heroic enough that he'd be willing to crash the device into the ground before he'd break off pursuit. With a sinking heart, he knew he wasn't, and he hated himself for that weakness. "I've got to pull up! Now! Go!" Spider-Man shouted. He dove from the sky stick an instant before Harry pulled up. Spider-Man intercepted Mary Jane in midair, and, wrapping his arm around her, fired a web. It snagged an overhead girder, and they arced upward, barely missing the ground and soaring mere inches over the head of a boy who was watching in the crowd. "Wicked cool!" crowed the kid. The crowd went wild as Spider-Man swung along with Mary Jane in his arms. Harry watched it all from a distance. He had just witnessed why exactly Peter Parker was a true hero who, damn it, deserved to get the girl. He resolved right then that his ridiculous crush on Mary Jane was at an end. Peter deserved to have her. And if that was what she wanted... Harry had made a tactical blunder. Allowing his mind to wander, even for an instant, was a costly mistake. Venom leaped forward from hiding and latched onto Harry's sky stick. Harry, realizing he'd picked up an unwanted passenger, angled upward, trying to shake him loose. No luck. Venom bared his vicious teeth and sank them into Harry's ankle. Harry shrieked, yanking his leg away before Venom could get a solid hold. Venom started to pull himself up, and a stiletto blade clicked out from the back of Harry's boot heel. Harry only had time to throw together a few pieces of the armor, but what he had chosen had been canny. He jammed the blade down into Venom's shoulder. The creature howled in protest, but still didn't let go. The sky stick banked with a whine of its engines. Venom was slammed against a concrete girder high atop the skyscraper. Venom was knocked loose, but the sky stick had sustained damage from Venom's assault. The engine was sounding labored, and it was all Harry could do to keep it on course. Nor was Venom done. Even as he fell, he fired a black web line and reconnected with the craft, swinging below it like a great dark pendulum. As Harry angled around, he saw Spider-Man landing on an upper portion of the skyscraper, where a small platform had been set up for construction workers. He watched as Spider-Man set Mary Jane down there and breathed a sigh of relief that at least she was safe. The ground stirred, twisted, grew, and a gigantic Sandman once again rose up before them. The missing portion of his head had reformed. "Uh-oh," said Harry, which by startling coincidence was exactly what Mary Jane said, as Sandman loomed in front of them. Peter Parker said something a little more colorful, but his mask muffled the words. On the street below, J. Jonah Jameson fought his way to the front of the crowd, searching the faces of the news photographers. Alerted to the goings-on, he hadn't been able to verify that the Bugle had anyone on the scene, and decided he couldn't trust anyone but himself to make sure his paper got pictures. Unfortunately, as the battery of photographers snapped away, capturing incredible action photos, Jameson didn't see a single one of his people. "Parker! Brock!" he called out, momentarily forgetting that he'd fired the latter. "Where's my photographers?" He turned and spotted an 8-year-old holding a cheap Instamatic camera. "Hey kid," he barked, "you want a job?" The girl stared at him incredulously. "No, I'm a kid. Why would I want a job?" Exasperated, Jonah growled, "All right, how much for the camera?" Looking at the camera and smelling Jonah's desperation the way a lion smells weakness, the kid announced, $100. $100?! The crowd gasped and pointed at some fantastic photo opportunity that Jameson was missing. Muttering, he yanked 250s from his wallet and forked them over to the kid. "Little crook," he snarled as the girl handed him the camera. Jameson raised it for a shot, pushed the shutter release, and couldn't get it to do anything. Then he stared at the back of the camera and popped it open to verify what he'd already figured out. It was empty. The kid held up a small box. "Film's extra," she said serenely. Spider-Man grabbed Mary Jane in a tackle hold and leaped with her out of harm's way as a gigantic sand fist pounded into the building. It trembled violently under the impact, but remained standing. Harry saw it all, but was distracted by his own problem. Venom was still climbing quickly up toward him. Tripping a switch, Harry ignited the thrusters on the bottom of the sky stick. They roared to life, and the rocket exhaust torched the shrieking Venom. Burning like a Roman candle, the flaming beast tumbled well away from the sky stick. Freed of Venom, Harry shot straight towards Sandman. The towering creature had just taken a swipe at Spider-Man, who swung himself and Mary Jane to safety. Safety being a relative term. Trying desperately to buy Peter some time, Harry buzzed past Sandman's face as a distraction. "I'm worth at least $30 million and I'm a flying sand mite. What a come down." In trying to get Sandman's attention, Harry was all too successful. Turning away from Spider-Man and Mary Jane, Sandman opened wide his hand and sent it blowing toward Harry at gale force. Harry tried to angle away from the blast, but was enveloped in a small tornado of sand. He shielded his eyes with one arm, as the sand flurry worked its way into the innermost recesses of the sky stick. Harry cut hard on the engine, dropping down out of the assault, but then the engine started to choke and sputter. He tried to get it under control, but to no avail as the vehicle hurtled across the sky, its gyros and servos disabled, and its steering mechanism completely shot. Fighting to stay aloft, Harry veered behind a distant building, cut off from the war that now waged without him. With Mary Jane safely out of the line of fire, Spider-Man was running across a girder when a sandstone arm smacked him hard across the face. It sent him flying downward, and he crashed hard into a half-constructed floor. Sandman had reduced himself to his normal size, but that didn't make him any less formidable. Having transformed his hand into a sandstone mace, he raised it above the head of a defenseless Spider-Man and growled, "Got no choice. You're in my way." "Daddy, stop!" To Peter's astonishment, Marco froze in place, and he turned his head in the direction from which the plea had come. A slowly rising construction elevator. A little girl was emerging from it, along with her mother. "Penny?" whispered Marco. He hadn't lowered the mace, and Spider-Man could have taken that moment to lash out. Instead, he made no move at all, waiting to see how this unexpected interruption would play out. I have to do this," Marco insisted. "You don't understand." "I do understand." "Flint," Emma said. "The doctor came. He told us everything." Penny sounded as if she was more concerned about her father's and the doctor's feelings than her own welfare as she said, "He tried, but he can't help me." A crestfallen Flint Marco lowered his mace arm, all the fight gone out of him. The little girl, seeming much older than her years, continued to speak to her father in slow, measured tones as she approached. "But it's okay, Daddy. It means you don't have to keep doing this. You don't have to hurt people anymore. You can come home." Marco shook his head. "I can't come home. He shifted his gaze to his wife. "I killed a man, Emma. I didn't mean to, but I did." He turned to Spider-Man. Penny held on to her mother, unsure of how to react to what her father was saying. Peter could relate to that. He wasn't sure how to react either. "I needed money for the medicine," Marco said to him. "I told your uncle all I wanted was the car. I was scared. He said, 'Why don't you put the gun away and go home?' Then I turned to see my buddy running over with the cash. I was scared, and your uncle stood up, and I don't know, my gun went off." Spider-Man listened carefully, dumbfounded, scarcely believing it. "There was a flash, a puff of smoke," Marco continued. "And I was standing there with this stupid expression on my face, and the old guy on the ground. My buddy, good old Carradine, he jumped in the car and peeled out of there. Left me behind to take the fall. I got on the ground next to Ben." Marco said the name uncomfortably, as if claiming a familiarity that he wasn't entitled to. He looked puzzled, like he couldn't understand what had gone wrong. I tried to pull him to his feet, shouted at him to get up. Then I heard the siren. I let his body slide out of my hands into the pavement. And then I lit out of there just as the crowd was gathering. He shook his head, reliving the pain, the suffering made real. "I spent a lot of nights wishing I could take it back." Peter was silent. All of this was so different from what he had imagined. It had never occurred to him that a hardened criminal such as Flint Marco could possibly show remorse, could possibly care about others. Peter thought of the regret he had endured over his belief that his inaction had resulted in Ben's death, and how he had wished in vain that he too could take back his actions. And yes, he had recently done some things because of the symbiote, but they hadn't come out of nowhere. They'd been fueled by his inner demons. The symbiote had simply unleashed the potential for evil that lurked within him, that probably lurked in everyone. And he thought of what Aunt May had said, about what Uncle Ben would have really wanted for them. Marco knelt down next to his daughter. "I still want to be with you more than anything. But I did wrong. Gotta pay for what I did." With a choked sob, Penny pulled against her mother's hand, and this time, a bit to Spider-Man's surprise, Emma released her. "I don't want you to leave," she wailed, and threw her arms around her father. She looked up at Spider-Man and said, "Won't you forgive him? I know he did a terrible thing to you, but he's a good man." Peter knew perfectly well that what he said, that his beliefs, weren't going to make a bit of difference in terms of what happened to Flint Marco. But there was more involved in this. There was a little girl who desperately needed to believe that her father stood for something valuable and good. And he wasn't entirely sure that she was wrong to believe that. "We've all done terrible things," Spider-Man told her. He paused a long moment, then finally managed to get the words out. "I forgive him." A sudden sound came from above them. They all looked up to see Venom, who had reappeared atop the partially completed building. An ear-splitting roar resounded, and Spider-Man shouted to Marco, "Get your family out of here!" Marco hesitated, looking from Spider-Man to the frightened faces of Penny and Emma. He hugged them fervently as Spider-Man again cried out, "Go! Save them!" Aware of the danger, Marco quickly clambered onto the construction elevator with his family, shielding them with his body should Venom try to attack them. Venom wasn't the least bit interested in assaulting Flint Marco's family. Instead, his full focus was on Spider-Man, and he lunged with a howl of rage. Spider-Man leapt toward him, prepared to end this one way or the other. Harry Osborn had impressed the hell out of himself. He had always given little credibility to his own technological or scientific abilities, but when push came to shove, he was able to get the job done. In this instance, he had landed the Sky Stick, completed the makeshift repairs, and gotten it off the ground again, all in a few minutes. Hurtling toward the construction site, he now saw Venom and Spider-Man slugging it out and gunned the engine so he could get there to help. Grabbing a steel pike, Venom swung it around and bashed Spider-Man across the chest with it. His ribs already damaged from earlier, Spider-Man felt a new jolt of pain rip across his torso as he was thrown back against a girder. Venom flipped the pike around, revealing its sharp, jagged edge. Clinging to the girder as much for support as anything else, Spider-Man grated, "Don't give in to the anger, Eddie. It just feeds the suit. It wants you to hate. Give it up." Venom hesitated, and just for a moment, Spider-Man thought he was getting through. But then Venom's voice grew firm, even challenging.
"How can I give this up? Finally, I'm somebody. Look at them down there."
He pointed at the crowds below.
"Waiting for my next move."
He advanced on Spider-Man and said cheerfully,
"I like being bad. It makes me happy."
His slow advance turned into a rapid charge as he thrust the pike forward for the death blow. Spider-Man braced himself, prepared to dodge but not sure if he would make it. From out of nowhere, Harry flew in, placing himself directly between the pike and Spider-Man. "Harry!" shouted Peter, and his heart shattered as the pike impaled Harry Osborn. Harry pitched backward as the pike slid out of him, losing control of the Sky Stick and crash landing atop a construction platform. Giving Harry no further attention, as if he had just stepped on an ant, Venom lunged again with the steel pike. Spider-Man twisted aside, and the pike struck the girder with a loud, almost deafening clang. The black goo of the Venom suit vibrated, migrating away from the shrillness, moving in ripples across Brock's body. Venom stumbled back, pained. Peter saw it all and remembered when he himself had been struggling to divest himself of the black suit. The church bell had been thundering overhead, but Peter had simply chalked up his ridding himself of the symbiote as some sort of battle of wills that he had won. Now, though, he realized the truth. "Sound," he murmured. Venom had meantime recovered. He raised the jagged pike and charged yet again. There was only a split second. Spider-Man kicked up into his hands a length of rebar at his feet, and in one fluid motion struck it against the girder. This time, with Peter's full muscle behind it, it generated a clang so sonorous that Peter could feel the fillings in his teeth vibrating in response. Because the rebar itself was generating the sound, the symbiote would be vulnerable to it, at least in theory. He lowered the rebar to meet the oncoming Venom, and Venom, staggering from the ringing, was unable to control his forward motion. He impaled himself upon the makeshift tuning fork that Spider-Man had fashioned and gasped in surprise. The deadly pike dropped from Venom's hands. Peter had taken care not to make the wound mortal. Eddie Brock would be in a world of hurt for a long time, but it wasn't intended to be fatal by any means. With any luck, though, it would be fatal for the symbiote because of the tonality. Peter's eyes widened in shock. Whatever the symbiote had done to him, it didn't compare with what it had done to Brock. It slithered off of him in response to the sound assault. But it left nothing behind. All that remained of Eddie Brock was a smoking skeleton. And Spider-Man couldn't help but wonder in horror if Brock had even been present at all. It might well have been the alien creature all along, talking and acting the way it believed Eddie Brock was supposed to. The gelatinous black goo reared up, forming a hideous face with gleaming fangs and serpent-like tongue. It had absorbed the materials of Eddie's form and fashioned it into its own rudimentary body. An arm or tentacle or some sort of appendage emerged from its amorphous structure as it snarled,
"Never wound what you can't kill."
It snared Spider-Man by the leg and started to draw him forward. It opened its mouth impossibly wide, ready to swallow Spider-Man whole. At that moment, a desperate Peter spotted a sling suspended from a crane. The sling was holding what appeared to be hundreds of steel rods. He fired a web line, snagged it, and yanked with all his might. The sling tilted wildly, dumping out steel rods, which in turn struck against the girders as they fell. A virtual hailstorm of 80 ringing rods pierced the creature in rapid succession, the sonic vibrations ripping it apart bit by bit. The symbiote sizzled, evaporated, and Peter was sure he heard the creature screaming in protest as the last of the black goo burned off into an inky smoke. Immediately, he gave the creature no further thought, for his attention was entirely on Harry. He fired a web line and swung over toward the platform where Harry had crash-landed. Mary Jane, whom he had brought to safety a short distance away, had already run to Harry, and now she was kneeling by his side. MJ was shaking her head in disbelief and saying, "Oh no, 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 no," over and over. Harry grimaced, weak, clutching his chest where an ugly red splotch was spreading quickly. "It got me pretty good. I'll get help." "No." Harry clutched Mary Jane's hand before she could move. "Stay with me." She cradled his head in her lap and smiled. He smiled sadly up at her and said, "Sorry about everything. And in the end you came for Pete and me. I was kind of brave back there, wasn't I?" She stroked his hair. "I'm so proud of you. I could never be that brave, like Peter or you." "No." Harry shook his head, although the movement clearly pained him. "It's there inside you. Peter's only strong because you're there." He coughed weakly, then said, "Hold my hand." Mary Jane took his hand and kissed it gently. Harry's eyes fluttered, but he fought to keep them open as Peter showed up and knelt next to him, pulling his mask off so Harry could see his face. "Don't leave us, pal," Peter urged. "We need you. MJ needs you." "It's you she loves," Harry said. "It's only ever been you." He fought for breath as Peter touched the side of his face that had been terribly mangled. "I should never have hurt you," Peter said. "Said those things. I forgive you, Pete." Peter looked at him in amazement. "How could you forgive me?" To Harry, the answer was so simple that he was surprised Peter even needed to ask. "You're my friend." Peter was smiling through his tears as Harry took his hand and grasped it firmly one last time. Harry returned the smile, and with that on his lips, with the rays of a rising sun stretching over the horizon, Harry Osborn passed away. Epilogue. Peter Parker is now more open to the idea of one's life flashing before one's eyes when death is imminent. But his own death is not imminent, and it is not the entirety of his existence that he is experiencing now. It is simply the most recent days. He sees himself, Mary Jane, Aunt May, and the Stacy family surrounding Harry's gravesite. His casket is in the ground. Peter and Mary Jane drop in some flowers. Gwen is standing there, now an austere, more thoughtful, no-nonsense young woman. She stands next to her father, across the lawn from Peter and MJ and Aunt May. Gwen and Peter eye each other. She moves toward him. Peter moves away from Mary Jane, toward Gwen. Mary Jane and Gwen exchange a look and smile. Peter and Gwen, facing one another, speak not a word between them. There is forgiveness and understanding between them. They embrace. Then Gwen looks again toward Mary Jane. She moves to MJ and hugs her as well. As all parties at the cemetery affirm their affection and support to each other, Peter muses to himself. The air is clear today. The lessons have been learned, but not easily. And they will be taught again. They are those things we know but often get forgotten along the way. That all we have that truly matters in this world is the love of our friends and our family, and that they are worthy of the highest trait that we can aspire to, our forgiveness. That is the gift my friend Harry gave me. Peter's world spins forward once more, and he hears a jazz band's playing of a torch song. It grows louder, and Mary Jane is singing, standing in front of the band, bathed in a soft spotlight, wearing a rather simple but divine gown. A sparse number of patrons are at a few tables, a couple at the bar. Everyone is captured by the song and the soft mood of the room. In the front window of the jazz room is a poster showing Mary Jane's attractive, enchanting photograph. Above it, on a small marquee, are the words, "Featuring Mary Jane Watson," and beneath it is a clipping from a newspaper review giving her performance 3 stars, describing her as a new enchanting songbird who has flown into town. Peter sees himself gazing at the picture, reading the review, then moving up to the doorway. He enters. Mary Jane keeps singing. As she sings, she smiles, surprised and pleased, upon seeing Peter standing in the doorway. She stops singing, and the band continues behind her. Peter steps toward the dance floor and mouths the word, "Dance?" She waits and then moves away from the microphone and onto the dance floor. They meet and slowly come together to dance as the band moves into its rendition of Falling in Love. The lounge's manager and bouncer eye Peter warily. MJ had told them, pleaded with them, that Peter's mayhem had been the result of clashing prescription drugs, an aberration that would never recur. Still, they never take their eyes off him. Well, let them stare. The last thing on Peter's mind is causing trouble. And Peter suddenly understands why his life, or at least recent events, are flashing before his eyes. It isn't because he is on the edge of death. It is because he is on the edge of finally living. After a few moments, he brings his cheek close to hers and whispers, "We have a lot to talk about. Let's not talk about the relationship. Just shut up and dance." And so they do. And in his mind's eye, Peter sees Spider-Man swinging across the city, through its cavernous streets, and Mary Jane is in his arms, laughing in delight. And all is as it should be. And that is the conclusion to my Spider-Man 3 audiobook. I hope you guys enjoyed it, because I enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun recording this, and I'll do it again. I do want to do the Spider-Man 4 audiobook once it comes out. So once the movie comes out, it'll be right on my it'll be right on my watch list. So thank you. Hold on a second. What? Yeah, the audiobook for the fourth Spider-Man novelization. I mean, it was pretty successful. What? There's not a Spider-Man 4 book? They canceled the movie? Oh, fuck! About the author. Peter David is the New York Times best-selling author of numerous Star Trek novels, including Imzadi, A Rock and a Hard Place, and the incredibly popular New Frontier series. He is also the author of the best-selling movie novelizations for Spider-Man, Spider-Man 2, The Hulk, and Fantastic Four, and has written dozens of other books, including his acclaimed original novel, Sir Apropos of Nothing, and its sequels, The Woe to Wewin and Tongue Lashing. David is also well known for his comic book work, particularly his award-winning run on The Incredible Hulk, and has written for just about every famous comic book superhero. He lives in New York with his wife and daughters.